Imagine a room that smells of ancient stone, expensive lavender, and the sharp metallic tang of a secret that's about to kill you. You aren't standing in a prison, you're standing in a theater where the lead actor eats his audience. Dr. Hannibal Lecter is waiting for you behind a wall of glass, not with a roar, but with a polite smile and a question that will peel your soul back like a grape. If you're ready to taste the darkness, stay with us until the very last course. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from as the lambs begin to scream. The Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane did not smell like a hospital. It smelled of ancient stone, floor wax, and the cold metallic tang of unexpressed secrets. In the administrative wing, Dr. Frederick Chilton adjusted his silk tie in a gilded mirror, a gesture that felt more like an actor preparing for a curtain call than a psychiatrist checking his appearance. This was his theater, and today, the play was about to begin a new, darker act. Chilton's eyes glittered with a predatory vanity. He took a sip of lukewarm sherry, savoring the way the liquid burned, a pale imitation of the power he felt every time he descended into the bowels of the building. Down there, in the high-security wing, lived the hospital's most prized possession, a man whose name was whispered in the corridors of the FBI with a mixture of reverence and primal fear, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. To the public, Lecter was a nightmare, a cannibal, a butcher of the elite. But to Chilton, he was a trophy. There was a perverse, soap opera-esque drama to their relationship, a constant tug-of-war where Chilton sought to dominate the man who had once been the toast of the Baltimore social scene. "He's ready for his consultation, I presume?" Chilton asked a passing nurse, his voice dripping with a forced, oily charm. "He's been still for 3 hours, doctor," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Just waiting. It's like he knows you're coming before you even leave your office." Chilton smirked. He loved the myth. He loved the way the very mention of Lecter made the staff's skin crawl. It was an aphrodisiac of authority. The walk to the final cell was a choreographed ritual. Through 3 sets of bars, past the humming of security cameras, and finally, into the cold, silent hallway where the air seemed to thicken. The other inmates were a chorus of the damned, some moaning, some screaming obscenities, but as Chilton approached the end of the hall, the noise died. The silence at the end of the corridor wasn't an absence of sound, it was a presence. It was a weight that pressed against the chest, demanding a physical response. And then there he was. Behind a wall of reinforced glass, not bars, for Lecter was far too clever to be given anything he could reach through, sat a man who looked less like a monster and more like a fallen aristocrat. He was seated at a small table, his back perfectly straight, sketching on a piece of parchment with the delicate precision of a Renaissance master. The cell was a paradoxical space. It was sterile, yet it felt lush with the ghost of a different life. There were books, Dante, Petrarch, medical journals, and the scent of something impossibly refined, a hint of lavender and the faint haunting aroma of expensive shaving cream. "Good morning, Frederick," the voice said. It was a voice like velvet over gravel, smooth, deep, and terrifyingly intimate. Lecter did not turn around. He didn't need to. He felt Chilton's presence like a heat source. "You're looking vibrant today," Lecter continued, finally turning his head. His eyes were the color of dried blood in the moonlight, maroon and piercing. They didn't just look at Chilton, they seemed to slide under his skin, cataloging the frantic beat of his pulse. "The tie is a bold choice. A cry for attention, perhaps? Or a desperate attempt to feel significant in a room where you are merely the janitor of my mind?" Chilton stiffened. "Always the provocateur, Hannibal. I'm here because the bureau is sniffing around again. They want a profile. Something fresh." Lecter stood up. His movements were fluid, devoid of the jerky agitation common in the incarcerated. He moved toward the glass with a slow, predatory grace that was undeniably magnetic. He stopped just inches from the surface. There was an electricity between them, a dark, twisted intimacy that transled the roles of doctor and patient. Lecter leaned in, his breath fogging the glass in a small rhythmic circle. "You want me to perform," Lecter whispered. "You want to watch me dissect a soul so you can feel the vicarious thrill of the kill. You've always been a voyeur, Frederick. You don't want the truth, you want the sensation." He placed a hand against the glass, his fingers long and elegant. It was a gesture that felt almost tender, yet it carried the threat of a strangler's grip. Chilton found himself leaning in, drawn into the doctor's orbit against his better judgment. The air in the hallway seemed to vanish, replaced by the sheer force of Lecter's persona. There was something undeniably carnal in the way Lecter spoke, a sensory indulgence that made the skin flush. He spoke of tasting thoughts and consuming the weaknesses of others as if he were describing a forbidden lover. The ambiguity of his hunger, was it for flesh, or for the absolute possession of another human being, hung in the air like a thick perfume. "I know what you dream of when you close your eyes in that lonely bed of yours," Lecter murmured, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in Chilton's marrow. "The power to make someone stay. The power to be the only thing they see. You envy me, Frederick. Not for my crimes, but for my intensity." Chilton felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. The drama of the moment was intoxicating. He was the warden, the man with the keys, yet in this glass-walled confessional, he felt stripped bare, laid out on a table for Lecter's amusement. It was a psychological seduction, a game where the stakes were nothing less than his own sanity. "I'm moving you, Hannibal," Chilton blurted out, trying to reclaim his dominance. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have the drawings removed. I'll take the books. I'll leave you in the white silence until you forget your own name." Lecter smiled. It was a small, knowing upturn of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. "You could try. But we both know you'd miss me too much. Who else would remind you that you're alive? Who else would give you this delicious friction?" Lecter turned back to his sketches, the brief flash of intimacy vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He was once again the cold, detached intellectual. But the damage was done. The atmosphere of the cell had shifted from a prison to a shrine. Chilton watched him for a long moment, his chest heaving. He knew the stories, the way Lecter had once convinced an inmate in the next cell to swallow his own tongue just by talking to him through the vents. He knew about the dinners, the flute players who were never seen again, and the way Lecter could make a person feel like the most important thing in the world right before he ended them. This was the legend. The man who was too refined for the world that birthed him, a monster who wore his civility like a bespoke suit. He was a creature of art and gore, a symphony played on human nerves. As Chilton turned to leave, his shoes clicking sharply on the stone floor, Lecter spoke one last time, without looking up. "Tell Jack Crawford to send me someone interesting, Frederick. Not another one of your dull, bureaucratic drones. Send me someone with flavor. Someone who still carries the scent of the barnyard and the fear of the dark." Chilton didn't respond. He hurried away, the heavy doors clanging shut behind him, but he could still feel those maroon eyes boring into the back of his neck. The stage was set. The monster was hungry, not just for a meal, but for a mirror. And somewhere out in the world, a young woman named Clarice Starling was waking up, unaware that she was about to become the leading lady in a grand bloody opera that would change the world forever. The FBI Academy at Quantico was a world of cold gravel, bruised shins, and the rhythmic, aggressive scent of gun oil. For Clarice Starling, it was also a sanctuary, a place where the chaotic ghosts of her West Virginia childhood could be outrun by a 1.5-mile sprint and silenced by a high score on the firing range. But as she stood in the office of Jack Crawford, the head of the behavioral science unit, the air felt different. It was heavy with the musk of old paper and the sharp medicinal bite of a man who lived on black coffee and high-stakes misery. Crawford didn't look up from his files. He was a man built of sharp angles and weary shadows. "Starling," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "You're doing well in forensic personality. Top of your class." "Thank you, sir," Clarice replied, her accent a faint melodic burr she fought to keep polished. "I have an errand," Crawford said, finally meeting her eyes. "A psychological interview. We're building a database on active serial killers, and there's one subject who has refused every overture. Dr. Hannibal Lecter." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Even in the sterile halls of Quantico, Lecter was the boogeyman. Clarice felt a sudden electric prickle at the base of her neck. "The Chesapeake Ripper," she whispered. "He's been in Baltimore for 8 years, Crawford continued, sliding a thin dossier across the desk. "He's brilliant, Starling. And he's bored. He's dismantled every psychiatrist Chilton has thrown at him. But you're a trainee. You're raw. You don't smell like the bureau yet. I want you to go in there, be polite, and get him to fill out this questionnaire." He didn't mention the danger. He didn't have to. The subtext was a dark, inviting curve. Go into the dark and see if you can come back out. The transition from the open air of Virginia to the claustrophobic depths of the Baltimore State Hospital felt like a descent into an underworld. Dr. Frederick Chilton met her at the entrance, his gaze lingering on the fit of her navy blazer with a proprietary oily interest that made Clarice's skin crawl. "He's a monster, Agent Starling." "Make no mistake," Chilton said, his voice dropping into a theatrical stage whisper as they descended the stone stairs. "We have strict protocols. Do not touch the glass. Do not pass him anything but soft paper. No pens, no staples. He's remarkably fast." They passed the normal inmates, men who roared and threw themselves against the bars, their madness loud and messy. But as they reached the final corridor, the world went silent. It was a vacuum. Chilton stopped at the edge of the shadows. "I'll leave you here. He finds my presence distracting." Clarice stepped forward. The heels of her sensible shoes sounded like gunshots against the stone. At the end of the hall, bathed in a soft artificial glow, was the glass cell. Dr. Hannibal Lecter was standing. He wasn't huddled in a corner or pacing like a caged beast. He stood with the poise of a dancer, his hands loosely clasped behind his back. As Clarice approached, he didn't move, yet she felt his gaze, a physical sensation, like a warm tongue sliding across her throat. "Closer, please," he said. The voice was a dark cello, vibrating through the glass. "I can't quite smell you from there." Clarice moved until she was inches from the barrier. The air between them was charged with a sudden, suffocating intimacy. Up close, Lecter was smaller than the legend suggested, but his presence was vast. His eyes, a deep predatory maroon, searched her face with an intensity that felt like a violation. "You're a trainee," he murmured, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "Jack Crawford sent a lamb to the slaughter. How very biblical of him." Clarice took a breath, trying to steady the frantic thrumming in her chest. "I'm here to ask for your help, Dr. Lecter. We're working on a profile." No, he interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to bypass her ears and go straight to her nerves. "Don't lie to me, Clarice. May I call you Clarice? It's such a delicate name. It tastes of spring rain and cheap soap." He leaned in, his face mere inches from hers on the other side of the glass. The ambiguity of his posture was maddening. He looked at her with a hunger that was simultaneously intellectual and deeply, disturbingly carnal. It wasn't the crude lust of the men in the other cells. It was the gaze of a man who wanted to peel back her layers, to taste the marrow of her secrets. "You use Evian skin cream," he said, his nostrils flaring slightly. "And sometimes l'air du temps, but not today. Today you're wearing the scent of ambition and a very cheap, very desperate attempt to hide your origin. You're a striver, aren't you, Clarice? One generation out of the mines? You smell of West Virginia coal and the scrubbed clean floors of a foster home." Clarice felt the blood rush to her face. He had dismantled her armor in seconds. The power dynamic shifted violently. She wasn't the investigator, she was the specimen. "You're very good, doctor," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "But I'm not here to talk about my childhood. There is a man out there, they call him Buffalo Bill. He's killing women. He's skinning them. You know things about this kind of transformation." Lecter's eyes sparked. The mention of the killer seemed to excite him, not out of moral outrage, but out of a dark professional curiosity. He began to pace, a slow hypnotic movement that forced Clarice to follow him with her eyes. "Transformation," he echoed, the word lingering in the air like a caress. "He wants to change. He hates his own skin, so he seeks to wear another's. It's a very intimate process, don't you think? To take the most private part of a person and drape it over yourself." He stopped suddenly and looked at her, his expression softening into something that looked dangerously like affection. "I might help you, Clarice. But I don't do anything for free. I find the Bureau's questionnaires tedious. I want something more visceral." He stepped back to the center of his cell, his shadow stretching long and thin against the white walls. "I will give you insights into this Buffalo Bill. I will lead you to the heart of his darkness. But for every piece of him I give you, you must give me a piece of yourself." "A trade?" Clarice asked. "A quid pro quo," Lecter whispered. "Truth for truth. Pain for pain. I want to know what drives you, Clarice. I want to know about the lambs. I want to know what makes you wake up in the middle of the night with your heart screaming in your ribs." He sat down at his table, picking up a piece of charcoal. He began to sketch her, not her face, but the tension in her shoulders, the set of her jaw. The atmosphere in the cell was no longer that of a prison, it was a sanctuary of forbidden knowledge. The silence between them was thick, heavy with the unspoken promise of a relationship that would blur the lines between mentor and monster, between predator and prey. "Think about it, Clarice," he said, his voice fading as he focused on his drawing. "Go back to your little room at Quantico. Sleep on it. And when you realize that I am the only one who can truly see you, come back to me." As Clarice turned to leave, her legs feeling like lead, she felt his eyes on her back. It wasn't a threat, it was a beckoning. She had entered the lion's den, and while she still had her life, she realized with a cold shudder that she had left a piece of her soul behind in that glass box. The game had begun, and the stakes were nothing less than the very essence of who she was. The air in the behavioral science unit at Quantico was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the electric hum of high-end Xerox machines, but for Clarice Starling, it felt like the inside of a tomb. On the corkboards, the nightmare had a name: Buffalo Bill. He was a shadow that lived in the peripheries of the American dream, leaving behind a trail of discarded lives that were no longer human, but material. The crime scene photos were a jagged sensory assault, vivid Polaroids of pale skin, missing patches, and the clinical cold precision of a tailor who worked in flesh. Jack Crawford stood over her, his presence a heavy paternal weight. He didn't offer comfort, he offered the only thing he had, the folder of the latest victim, Catherine Martin, the daughter of a United States Senator. The stakes had shifted from a grisly procedural to a national crisis, and the only bridge to the killer was a man sitting in a glass box in Baltimore. When Clarice returned to the asylum, the atmosphere had ripened. The transition from the world of the living to Lecter's corridor felt like a slow-motion dive into deep, dark water. This time, there was no Dr. Chilton to act as a buffer. The hallway was a vacuum of sound, save for the distant rhythmic thumping of an inmate's head against stone. As she approached the final cell, she saw that the lion was waiting. Dr. Hannibal Lecter was seated at his table, the charcoal sketch of Clarice from their previous meeting pinned to the wall behind him like a butterfly in a display case. He looked at her with a terrifyingly focused attention, his head tilted as if he could hear the frantic pace of her heart from 10 feet away. The tension between them was no longer just the friction of an interview, it had evolved into a dark, seductive tether. "The senator's daughter," Lecter said, his voice a velvet purr that seemed to vibrate against the glass. "A high-stakes game of hide-and-seek. You look tired, Clarice. You've been living on caffeine and the fear of failure. It's a very pungent combination." He rose from his seat, his movements fluid and unervingly silent, moving toward her until only the reinforced pain separated their faces. He leaned in, his nostrils flaring slightly as he took her in. "You've come for the monster's wisdom because the Bureau's computers are silent. Tell me, what does the Ripper see in these photographs that the FBI misses?" Clarice didn't flinch, though every instinct told her to flee. She held up the autopsy report of the previous victim. "He keeps them for days before he kills them. He starves them. Why, doctor? Is it about the struggle? Is it about the pain?" Lecter laughed, a soft, dry sound that carried no mirth. It was a sound of appreciation, like a teacher witnessing a student almost grasp a complex theorem. He moved closer still, his hand coming up to rest on the glass, fingers spread. It was a carnal gesture, a simulation of touch that made the air in the corridor feel impossibly thin. The ambiguity of his hunger was palpable. He didn't just want the information she carried, he wanted the intimacy of her psyche. He wanted to be the one to peel back her skin and see what lay beneath the uniform. "No, Clarice. Pain is a byproduct, not the goal," Lecter whispered, his breath creating a small rhythmic fog on the glass that obscured his lips, making his voice seem to come from everywhere at once. "He is a craftsman. He is looking for fit. He harvests the skin because he believes he can sew himself a new identity. He hates who he is, so he seeks to become something beautiful, something powerful. It's a metamorphosis, a cocoon made of other people's dreams." He paused, his maroon eyes boring into hers with a heat that felt like a physical caress. "But you know about wanting to change, don't you? You know about the desire to leave the dirt behind and walk into the light as someone else. Quid pro quo, Clarice. I've given you the why. Now give me the when." The trade began. Clarice felt the walls of the asylum fading away, replaced by the ghost of a cold West Virginia morning. She told him about the farm, the sound of the lambs screaming in the dark, and the frantic, hopeless attempt to save just one. She spoke of the blood on her coat and the cold that never truly left her bones. As she talked, Lecter's expression changed. The predatory sharpness softened into a look of exquisite, almost sensual appreciation. He wasn't just listening, he was consuming her grief, savoring the texture of her trauma as if it were a rare vintage. The intimacy of the moment was profound and deeply disturbing, a psychological stripping that left her more exposed than if she were standing before him without clothes. "And when the lamb died, Clarice?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to stroke her spine. "Did you think that by saving Catherine, you could finally make the screaming stop? Did you think you could trade one life for your own peace?" He leaned his forehead against the glass, his eyes locked on hers in a gaze that was both a challenge and an invitation. The power dynamic had completely collapsed. In this moment, they weren't agent and inmate, they were two souls bound in a dark symbiotic dance. He was feeding her the clues, the mention of transformation, the hint that the killer might have known his victims, but the price was her absolute vulnerability. The chapter reached its peak as the lights in the corridor flickered, a sudden surge in the building's aged wiring that cast long rhythmic shadows across Lecter's face. For a heartbeat, he looked less like a man and more like an ancient, beautiful demon presiding over a rite of passage. He reached into the small pass-through slot at the bottom of the glass, his fingers hovering just inches from hers. He didn't touch her, the rules forbade it, but the electricity between their hands was a physical force, a tempting, dangerous bridge over an abyss. "Go, Clarice," he murmured, his voice thick with a dark, satisfied hunger. "Follow the thread. Look for the girl who was the first. Look for the one he knew. And remember, the lambs are still screaming. They will always be screaming, until you find the courage to be as cold as I am." As Clarice walked away, the sound of her own breathing seemed too loud in the silent hall. She had the lead, the Belvedere connection, but she also felt a terrifying sense of completion. Lecter had seen her. He had tasted her past and found it delicious. The hunt for Buffalo Bill was no longer just a case. It was a race to see if she could catch a killer before she was completely consumed by the man who was teaching her how to hunt. The game of minds was no longer a game, it was a transformation of its own, and as she stepped out into the night air, she realized she was no longer the same woman who had entered the lion's den. The scent of the asylum, of the lavender and the blood, followed her home, a lingering, invisible mark of the doctor's possession. The air in the makeshift cell atop the Shelby County Courthouse in Memphis was thick with the scent of floor wax and the heavy, humid promise of a Tennessee storm. Hannibal Lecter did not belong here, in this cage of white bars and fluorescent humming, yet he occupied the space with the casual elegance of a king in exile. His transfer from the grim stone of Baltimore had been a masterpiece of manipulation, a delicate symphony of half-truths and promises whispered into the ears of Senator Martin and the ever-ambitious Dr. Chilton. Now he sat in the center of the room, a small table before him, dining on a catered meal of lamb chops and extra-rare protein, his movements so precise they bordered on the ritualistic. The guards, Sergeant Pembroke and Officer Boyle, stood outside the bars, their presence a clumsy intrusion on his solitude. They watched him with a mixture of revulsion and a hidden, forbidden fascination. There was something undeniably magnetic about the way Lecter commanded the room, a dark charisma that made the very air feel charged with a static, carnal energy. He was a predator who had successfully beckoned the world to his doorstep, and as he sipped his tea, the ambiguity of his calm was more terrifying than any roar. The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled spring waiting for the slightest friction to snap. Boyle, the younger of the two, couldn't stop looking at the doctor's hands, long, pale, and impossibly steady. He felt a strange, creeping heat in his chest, a psychological pull that Lecter exerted without saying a word. It was the soap opera of the soul. The doctor played on their insecurities, their unspoken desires, and their hidden fears until the walls of the cell seemed to dissolve. Lecter looked up, his maroon eyes catching the light of the overhead fixtures, and smiled a slow, knowing smile. "It's the waiting that's the most exquisite part, isn't it, Officer Boyle?" he murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to bypass the ears and strike directly at the base of the spine. "The anticipation of the strike, the moment before the skin is breached. It's almost better than the act itself." Boyle swallowed hard, his hand hovering near his holster, but he didn't move. He was under the spell of a man who treated violence like a high art and human interaction like a delicate, sensory seduction. Then, the rhythm of the evening shattered. With the grace of a striking cobra, the transition from civility to carnage was instantaneous. A hidden piece of wire, harvested from the very pen Chilton had used to sign the transfer papers, was suddenly in Lecter's hand. As Pembroke leaned in to retrieve the dinner tray, the doctor was upon him. There was no struggle, only a terrifyingly efficient sequence of movements that looked more like a dance than a murder. Lecter moved with a surgical rhythmic beauty, his body pressed against the guards in a mockery of an embrace. The violence was intimate, a dark fusion of two bodies in a space where the air was suddenly choked with the metallic tang of fresh blood. Boyle, frozen in a state of sensory overload, could only watch as his partner was dismantled with a cold, terrifying grace. The ambiguity of Lecter's expression, a look of intense, almost ecstatic focus, suggested that this wasn't just an escape, it was a consummation of his nature. He wasn't just killing, he was creating a masterpiece of gore that would haunt the FBI for decades. As Boyle finally reached for his weapon, Lecter was already there, his movements a blur of refined brutality. The officer felt a sudden, sharp pressure against his throat, and then the world began to fade into a rhythmic, pulsing red. Lecter leaned in close, his lips brushing against Boyle's ear in a gesture that was disturbingly tender. "You should have kept your eyes on the hands, Philip," he whispered, the use of the guard's first name a final, intimate violation. "The hands are where the soul speaks." With a final, decisive movement, the room went silent, save for the heavy, wet sound of blood dripping onto the polished floor. Lecter stood amidst the wreckage of the room, his white uniform now a canvas of crimson splatter, yet he looked entirely unruffled. He began the next phase of his performance with the methodical patience of a man preparing for a gala. He didn't just leave, he transformed the scene. He draped Pembroke's body over the top of the cage in a grotesque angelic pose, a visual symphony of skin and sinew that was meant to be seen, to be felt, to be feared. The true genius of the escape lay in the deception that followed. As the backup teams began to scramble below, alerted by the silence on the monitors, Lecter did the unthinkable. He didn't hide, he changed. Using the tools of his trade, the sharp edge of a broken plate and the clinical knowledge of a surgeon, he removed the face of the fallen guard and wore it as his own. It was the ultimate transformation, a dark mirror of the very killer Clarice was hunting. When the paramedics arrived to find what they thought was a surviving mutilated officer, they rushed him into the ambulance, never realizing that the man beneath the blood-soaked bandages was the very devil they were trying to contain. The ambiguity of the moment was thick as the ambulance sped away from the courthouse. The sirens wailed like the lambs in Clarice's dreams, but inside the vehicle, there was only the calm, rhythmic breathing of a man who had finally stepped out of the glass and back into the world. By the time the FBI realized the body in the ambulance was Lecter, he was gone. He had vanished into the humid Memphis night, leaving behind a trail of sensory trauma and a legacy of blood. The friend he was having for dinner was no longer a metaphor, it was a promise. As he stepped out of the stolen vehicle on a dark tree-lined street, he felt the rain begin to fall, a cool, rhythmic cleansing that washed away the scent of the courthouse and replaced it with the smell of wet earth and freedom. He was no longer a prisoner, he was a phantom, a civilized evil walking freely among the unsuspecting. The chapter closed on the image of a man shedding his blood-stained clothes for a clean, expensive suit he had cashed weeks ago, his eyes reflecting the distant city lights with a predatory, satisfied gleam. The lion was out of the den, the game had changed, and Clarice Starling was now hunting a ghost who knew her better than she knew herself. The hunt was no longer about a map, it was about the dark, intimate connection that still hummed in the air between them, a tether that not even an escape could break. The cold, persistent drizzle of Belvedere, Ohio, felt like a shroud against Clarice Starling's skin, a damp reminder that she was now operating in a world where the safety net of the FBI had been unraveled by the very man who had taught her how to see. With Hannibal Lecter vanished into the ether, a ghost in a bespoke suit, the atmosphere of the investigation had shifted from a clinical hunt to a fever dream of isolation. Clarice moved through the town like a phantom herself, her mind a rhythmic loop of Lecter's whispers and the static of crime scene photos. She was following the ghost of Frederica Bimmel, the first girl, the one the killer had known. The air in Belvedere was thick with the scent of wet coal and the stagnant breath of a town that had forgotten how to hope, and as Clarice stood before the door of a nondescript, weathered house, she felt a sudden, electric surge of certainty. This was the center of the web. The ambiguity of the mundane exterior, peeling paint and overgrown weeds, hid a rot so profound it seemed to pulse against the soles of her shoes. When the door opened, she was met not by a monster, but by a man who looked like a discarded fragment of a person. James Gum, calling himself Jack Gordon, stood in the shadows of the foyer, his presence a jarring mixture of nervous fragility and a deep buried aggression. The house smelled of mothballs and something sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit hidden behind a heavy curtain. As Clarice stepped inside, the door clicking shut with a finality that made her pulse leap, she felt a familiar carnal tension, the same dark seductive energy she had felt behind the glass in Baltimore, but here it was raw, unrefined, and chaotic. Gum's eyes didn't just look at her, they catalogued her, moving over the line of her throat and the curve of her shoulders with a hungry, appreciative gaze that felt like an invisible hand. He spoke of sewing, of the fit of a garment, his voice a high, rhythmic trill that masked a predatory intent. The air in the narrow hallway was suffocating, charged with the forbidden intimacy of a man who viewed human skin as nothing more than a beautiful, replaceable silk. The realization hit her like a physical blow when a death's head hawkmoth fluttered past his face, its wings a rhythmic, dusty beat against the stale air. In that heartbeat, the soap opera of the investigation reached its crescendo, the mask of the polite neighbor slipped, and the predator stood revealed. Gum retreated into the depths of the house, his movements sudden and fluid, disappearing into a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Clarice drew her weapon, her breathing shallow and rhythmic, and followed him into the abyss. The descent into the basement was a journey into a literal and figurative underworld. The air grew colder, more humid, and heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of fear. She passed through rooms filled with half-finished garments, the pale, preserved skin hanging like tapestries in a macabre gallery. The ambiguity of the art was terrifying. It was a sanctuary of transformation, a place where the line between male and female, human and object, had been violently erased. As she reached the lowest level, the sound of a woman's voice, raw, rhythmic, and pleading, echoed from a deep circular pit in the center of the floor. Catherine Martin was there, a broken flower in a garden of horrors, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended language. Clarice stood at the edge of the pit, the darkness of the basement pressing in on her like a heavy velvet cloak. She felt a sudden terrifying sense of being watched, not just by Gum, but by the memory of Lecter, his voice a phantom presence in her ear, guiding her through the dark. The tension was no longer about the arrest, it was about the sensory experience of the hunt. She felt the vibrations of the house, the rhythmic hum of a sewing machine somewhere in the shadows, and the sudden, sharp scent of Gum's sweat. The predator was close, moving with the silence of a dream, and as the light suddenly flickered and died, Clarice was plunged into a total suffocating blackness. In the dark, the world became a symphony of touch and sound. She could hear her own heart, a frantic rhythmic drum against her ribs, and the distant wet sound of Gum's breathing. He was wearing night vision goggles, watching her stumble through the shadows with a godlike, voyeuristic pleasure. The ambiguity of the moment was almost sexual in its intensity. She was utterly vulnerable, a specimen laid bare in the dark, while he savored the sight of her fear. He moved closer, his breath warm against the back of her neck, his presence a heavy, electric weight. He didn't just want to kill her, he wanted to possess the moment of her ending, to watch the light leave her eyes with the same appreciation a connoisseur might have for a rare vintage. Clarice felt the cold air of a door opening behind her, the rhythm of his footsteps shifting from wood to concrete, and she realized he was toyed with her, leading her deeper into his private hell. The basement was a labyrinth of hanging plastic sheets and narrow corridors that smelled of chemicals and old blood. Clarice moved by touch, her hands sliding over the cold, slick surfaces, her senses heightened to a painful degree. Every creak of the floorboards was a gunshot, every rustle of the plastic was a threat. She felt a sudden, sharp prickle on her skin, the sensation of a gaze so intense it felt like a physical caress. Gum was inches away, his hand reaching out to touch the hair at the nape of her neck, his fingers hovering just short of the skin. The temptation to scream was a rhythmic pulse in her throat, but she silenced it, focusing on the sensory clues, the smell of the moth, the slight change in the air pressure, the rhythmic click-click of the goggle's infrared sensor. She was a lamb in the dark, but she was a lamb that had learned how to bite. As she turned a corner, she saw the faint, ghostly glow of the pit again, a beacon of misery in the gloom. She moved toward it, her gun held steady, her eyes straining to pierce the blackness. The atmosphere was one of claustrophobic suspense, a pressure cooker of unexpressed violence and forbidden desires. Gum was watching her from the shadows of a heavy work table, his breath hitching in a rhythmic, ecstatic sob. He was ready to strike, his body coiled with the energy of a man about to complete his masterpiece. The ambiguity of their connection in that moment was profound. They were bound together in a dark, intimate ritual of life and death, a transformation that would leave neither of them unchanged. As Gum raised his weapon, the click of the hammer caulking was the final note in the symphony of the hunt. The shadows seemed to lean in, eager to witness the climax of the story, as Clarice spun toward the sound, her finger tightening on the trigger in a rhythmic, decisive motion that would either silence the lambs forever or drown the world in a new, more terrible scream. The sound of the shots firing in the dark was not a roar, but a series of rhythmic metallic cracks that shattered the thick velvet silence of the basement. In that split second, the muzzle flashes illuminated the room like a strobe light in a house of horrors, catching Jane Gum in mid-gesture, a man-monster reaching for a dream of silk and skin, only to find the cold reality of lead. Clarice Starling felt the kick of the weapon deep in her shoulder, a rhythmic vibration that anchored her to the present even as the darkness tried to swallow her whole. Gum fell with a heavy, wet thud, his night vision goggles clattering against the concrete like the discarded shell of an insect. As the echoes died away, the silence that returned was different. It was no longer heavy with the threat of a predator, but hollow, echoing with the absence of a soul. Clarice stood over him, her breathing a ragged rhythmic sound in the gloom, her nostrils filled with the sharp acidic tang of gunpowder and the sudden cloying scent of fresh blood. The soap opera of the hunt had reached its bloody finale, and as she holstered her weapon, she felt a profound shivering sense of relief that was inextricably tangled with a deep lingering trauma. The rescue of Catherine Martin was a blur of sensory overload, the rhythmic wail of sirens approaching through the Ohio mist, the harsh artificial glare of flashlights cutting through the basement shadows, and the frantic sobbing gratitude of a woman who had seen the bottom of the world and survived. Clarice moved through the aftermath like a sleepwalker, her skin still prickling with the ghost of Gum's gaze. The ambiguity of her victory was palpable. She had saved the girl, she had killed the monster, yet the lambs in her mind were not yet silent. They were merely hushed, waiting for the next tremor in the dark. The FBI arrived in force, a sea of blue jackets and clinical efficiency that tried to turn the nightmare into a series of evidence bags and reports. Jack Crawford found her in the driveway, his hand on her shoulder a heavy, grounding weight. He didn't need to say the words. The case was closed, the career was made, but the look in Clarice's eyes told him that the price of her heroism had been written in a currency she wasn't sure she could afford. Weeks passed, and the world began to move on, turning the horror of Buffalo Bill into a sensationalist headline, but for Clarice, the transformation was permanent. The graduation ceremony at Quantico was a rhythmic display of tradition and order, the crisp uniforms, the polished brass, the proud families. As Clarice stepped onto the stage to receive her credentials, she looked like a model of FBI excellence, yet beneath the surface, the Lecter legacy hummed like a low-frequency wire. She had entered the academy as a girl trying to outrun the farm. She was leaving as a woman who had looked into the abyss and felt the abyss look back with an appreciative, maroon-eyed stare. The air in the auditorium felt too thin, too sterile. She kept expecting to smell the lavender and the antiseptic, to hear the velvet purr of a voice that had dismantled her psyche with the precision of a surgeon. The ceremony ended, the caps were tossed, but the celebration felt like a hollow performance, a soap opera ending that ignored the dark subtext still lingering in the wings. The climax of the day came not on the stage, but in the quiet, shadowed corner of the reception hall where a single, unmarked envelope waited for her. Inside was a simple, elegant card, the handwriting a rhythmic, flowing script that Clarice recognized with a jolt of visceral electricity. It was a request for a phone call, a set of instructions that led her to a secluded payphone on a wind-swept street corner as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The ambiguity of the moment was thick as the phone began to ring, a rhythmic, demanding sound that cut through the evening air. When she picked it up, the silence on the other end was heavy with a familiar, predatory intimacy. She didn't have to speak, he knew she was there. She could almost feel his breath through the receiver, a warm, rhythmic sensation that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Well, Clarice," the voice whispered, the velvet over gravel more pronounced than ever. "Have the lambs stopped screaming?" The sound of his voice was a physical caress, a sensory trigger that brought the walls of the Baltimore asylum rushing back. Hannibal Lecter was calling from a world away. The background noise suggested a tropical breeze, the rhythmic clinking of ice in a glass, and the distant melodic hum of a foreign city. He sounded relaxed, almost triumphant, a man who had shed his cage and rediscovered the sensory delights of the world. He spoke of the beauty of the sunset where he was, describing the colors with a carnal intensity that made Clarice feel exposed, as if he could see the flush on her cheeks through the phone line. The ambiguity of his intent remained his greatest weapon. He wasn't threatening her, he wasn't mocking her. He was simply checking in on his favorite project. "I have no plans to visit you, Clarice," Lecter continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that vibrated in her very bones. "The world is much more interesting with you in it, pursuing your little heroisms. I think it would be a pity to end our conversation so soon." He paused, and she could hear the rhythmic sip of a drink, the sound of a man savoring a masterpiece. "I do, however, have an appointment. An old friend, you might say. Dr. Chilton has been so very helpful over the years, and I find I have a sudden, persistent hunger for his company." The implication hung in the air like a thick, intoxicating perfume, a promise of violence wrapped in the language of a dinner invitation. The friend was the meal, and the soap opera of their lives was merely shifting to a more international stage. Clarice stood by the payphone long after the line went dead, the rhythmic dial tone a hollow echo of the connection they had shared. She looked out at the street, at the ordinary people walking by, unaware that a civilized evil was moving among them with a predatory grace. The lambs were silent for now, but she knew the silence was temporary. Lecter was free, a phantom architect of a new moral code, and she was the only one who truly understood the rhythm of his mind. The chapter closed on the image of Clarice walking back into the light of the city, her silhouette sharp and determined, while thousands of miles away, Hannibal Lecter adjusted his Panama hat and followed a nervous, sweating Dr. Chilton into the shadows of a crowded marketplace. The game wasn't over, it had simply become a grander, bloodier opera, and as the curtain fell on this act, the scent of lavender and old blood lingered in the air, a final, tempting ambiguity that promised the devil was only just getting started. The air in Florence did not carry the sterile, sharp bite of Baltimore. Instead, it was a thick, rhythmic tapestry of old parchment, espresso, and the faint, sweet decay of centuries-old marble. Years had passed since the night the lambs had finally fallen silent, and in that time, Dr. Hannibal Lecter had transformed himself into Dr. Fell, the esteemed curator of the Capone Library. He moved through the cobblestone streets with a predatory elegance that the locals mistook for aristocratic grace, his presence a dark, seductive hum beneath the vibrant skin of the city. He spent his days surrounded by Botticelli and Dante, his fingers tracing the edges of ancient manuscripts with a sensory reverence that bordered on the carnal. The ambiguity of his existence was his greatest shield. He was a man of immense culture, a connoisseur of the finer things, and yet, beneath the bespoke linen suits and the intellectual discourse, the Ripper remained, a coiled, rhythmic hunger waiting for the right note to strike. He lived in a state of exquisite exile, savoring the irony of a world that celebrated his mind while remaining blissfully ignorant of the blood that had paved his path to the Uffizi. But the soap opera of Lecter's life was never destined for a quiet finale. Across the Atlantic, in a darkened room that smelled of ozone and expensive antiseptic, a ghost was stirring. Mason Verger, the only victim to survive an encounter with the doctor, sat amidst a forest of life support machinery, his face a grotesque, rhythmic mask of scar tissue and hatred. He had no nose, no lips, and his eyes were perpetually open, staring into a past where Lecter had convinced him to peel off his own skin with a piece of broken glass. The atmosphere of Verger's estate, Muskrat Farm, was a stark contrast to the beauty of Florence. It was a sanctuary of vengeance, a place where the air was heavy with the scent of man-eating boars and the cold, metallic tang of a multi-million-dollar bounty. Verger didn't just want Lecter dead, he wanted a transformation of his own, a rhythmic, agonizing slow-motion feast where the predator became the prey. He had spent years weaving a web of corruption, buying off Italian police and FBI officials, waiting for the one rhythmic slip-up that would reveal the doctor's location. The catalyst for the collision was a rhythmic, persistent scent, the scent of a rare, expensive hand cream that Lecter had ordered from the Farmacia di Santa Maria Novella. It was a sensory breadcrumb that only a mind as sharp as Clarice Starling's could hope to follow, but it was Verger's gold that reached Florence first. Inspector Rinaldo Puzzi, a man whose ambition was as rhythmic as his heartbeat, saw in Dr. Fell not a scholar, but a winning lottery ticket. The tension in the Florentine nights began to tighten, a dark, seductive game of cat and mouse where the roles were constantly shifting. Lecter knew he was being watched. He felt the rhythmic gaze of the inspector like a heat source against the back of his neck. He didn't flee, he leaned into the danger, treating the pursuit as a new form of entertainment. He invited Puzzi into his world, offering him lectures on the history of betrayal and the aesthetics of the scaffold, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the inspector's skin flush with a mixture of greed and primal fear. The ambiguity of their interactions was intoxicating, a dance of two men, each believing they were the hunter, while the shadow of the gallows loomed over the Palazzo Vecchio. Back in America, Clarice Starling found herself caught in the rhythmic gears of a system that had turned against her. Sidelined by the bureau and harassed by the oily, vengeful Paul Krendler, she lived in a state of hyper-aware isolation. Her connection to Lecter had become a scarlet letter, a professional stain that she couldn't wash away. Yet, when the news of the Fell investigation reached her, she felt a sudden, electric surge of purpose. The tether that bound her to the doctor was still hummed with a carnal intensity. She knew the rhythm of his mind better than the men who were hunting him for profit. She saw the trap Verger was setting, the bores, the brutality, the public execution, and she felt a deep, disturbing impulse to intervene. It wasn't about justice anymore. It was about the sanctity of the connection they shared. The soap opera of her life had become a dark romance with a monster, and as she independently tracked the movements of Verger's mercenaries, she realized she was moving toward a reunion that would either destroy her or complete her. The atmosphere in Florence reached a boiling point on the night of the hanging. Lecter, sensing the rhythm of the climax, lured Puzzy to the library. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and the electric charge of an approaching storm. In a scene of operatic violence, Lecter turned the inspector's greed into a death sentence. The ambiguity of the act was profound. He was a surgeon, a butcher, and an artist all at once, executing the man with a rhythmic, clinical precision that mirrored the historical betrayals they had discussed. Avarice, libido, and pride, Lecter whispered as he prepared the rope, his voice a dark caress in the silent hall. You should have stayed with the art, Rinaldo. The flesh is so much more complicated. As Puzzy's body fell from the balcony, a grotesque pendulum against the Florentine skyline, Lecter didn't linger to celebrate. He knew the trap had been sprung, and the scent of the boars was already drifting across the ocean. He moved through the night like a shadow, shedding the identity of Dr. Fell for the more primal skin of the Ripper. He knew that Mason Verger's men were closing in, and he knew that somewhere, Clarice Starling was watching. The return to the United States was a rhythmic necessity, a journey back to the heart of the darkness where his story had begun. He didn't fear the pigs or the pain. He hungered for the confrontation, for the moment when the beauty and the beast would finally stand in the same room without the glass between them. The chapter closed on the image of Lecter aboard a private jet, sipping a glass of Chateau d'Homme, the golden liquid reflecting the predatory gleam in his eyes. He was going home to Muskrat Farm, not as a victim, but as a devil coming to claim his due. The air was charged with a tempting ambiguity, the promise of a transformation so visceral and intimate that it would leave the world gasping. The lambs were about to scream again, but this time, the doctor was the one who would decide when the music stopped. The air at Muskrat Farm was not the clean, salt-tinged breeze of the Maryland coast, nor the ancient, cultured breath of Florence. It was a heavy, rhythmic pulse of mud, musk, and the primal low-frequency grunting of the Sardinian boars. The atmosphere was thick with a sensory brutality that felt like a regression of the human spirit. In the center of this rot sat Mason Verger, his life support equipment humming a sterile rhythmic counterpoint to the chaotic squeals of the beasts below. He had created a theater of revenge where the predator was to be consumed by the very embodiment of mindless hunger. Hannibal Lecter, bound to a wooden cross in the center of the arena, looked less like a prisoner and more like a dark deity overseeing a sacrificial rite. Even in his restraint, he exuded a carnal, tempting ambiguity. He was silent, his maroon eyes tracking the movement of the shadows with a calm that made the mercenary's skin crawl. He wasn't waiting for death, he was waiting for the final movement of his symphony to begin. The rhythm of the night shattered when Clarice Starling emerged from the treeline. She didn't come with the sirens and the tactical teams of the FBI, she came alone, a silhouette of grace against the jagged backdrop of Verger's madness. Her presence changed the energy of the farm, shifting it from a slaughterhouse to a stage for an intimate, dangerous reunion. As she moved through the mud, her weapon drawn but held with a steady rhythmic discipline, she felt Lecter's gaze lock onto her. It was a physical sensation, a warm electric caress that bypassed her armor and struck at the very core of her identity. The soap opera of their shared history, the Baltimore glass, the phone calls, the unspoken trades, distilled into this single suffocating moment. She wasn't there to save the law, she was there to save the only man who had ever truly seen her. The confrontation was a masterpiece of rhythmic chaos. As Verger's men moved to stop her, the boars, driven into a frenzy by the scent of blood and the electric tension in the air, broke their restraints. The sound was a visceral rhythmic roar of hooves and snapping jaws. In the confusion, Clarice moved with a predatory elegance she had learned from the doctor himself. She cut Lecter's bonds not with a sense of duty, but with a rhythmic, decisive stroke that felt like a liberation of her own soul. The violence that followed was surgical and absolute. Lecter, now free, didn't flee. He turned his attention to Mason Verger with a look of exquisite, carnal focus. He didn't use a knife, he used the rhythm of the environment, turning Verger's own cruelty against him. The ambiguity of the moment was profound. As Verger was dragged into the pit by his own pets, the air was filled with a scream that finally drowned out the lambs of Clarice's past. But the true ending, the one that resonated with the dark, rhythmic heart of their connection, happened in the quiet aftermath. Clarice had been wounded in the fray, a shallow graze that left her lightheaded and vulnerable. Lecter carried her away from the carnage of Muskrat Farm, his movements fluid and tender, a mocking echo of a hero carrying a damsel. He took her to a secluded, elegant sanctuary he had prepared, a place that smelled of lavender, old books, and wood smoke. The atmosphere was one of high-stakes intimacy, a domesticity built on a foundation of blood and transformation. As she drifted in and out of a drug-induced haze, Clarice felt the world being rewritten. Lecter wasn't just healing her body, he was rebuilding her mind, replacing the cold, bureaucratic structures of the FBI with a new, more visceral moral code. When she finally awoke, she found herself seated at a table laid with the finest silver and crystal, the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock the only sound in the room. Lecter sat across from her, dressed in a sharp, dark suit, his expression one of paternal, yet disturbingly seductive pride. The meal before them was a work of art, a sensory indulgence that defied the horrors they had just escaped. The ambiguity of the situation was at its peak. She was his captive, his student, and his equal all at once. He spoke to her not as an agent, but as a fellow traveler in the dark. "The world is a very dull place, Clarice," he murmured, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to stroke her skin. "They wanted you to be a lamb, to be consumed by their rules and their small, rhythmic lives. But I saw the lion in you. I saw the beauty in your capacity for intensity." He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers. For the first time, there was no glass between them. The air was thick with a tempting, carnal electricity. Clarice didn't pull away. She looked at her own hands, stained with the soil of the farm and the blood of the hunt, and she realized that the screaming had finally stopped. It hadn't stopped because she had saved a girl, it had stopped because she had accepted the monster within herself. She reached out and placed her hand in his, a rhythmic, decisive movement that signaled the end of her life as she knew it. The transformation was complete. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't a hero. She was something new, a creature of refined fire and cold, beautiful logic. The final image was one of absolute, civilized evil walking hand in hand with a newly birthed goddess. They stood on a balcony overlooking a moonlit sea, the rhythmic sound of the waves a soothing backdrop to their shared silence. They were the architects of their own world, moving through society with a predatory grace that no one would ever suspect. The soap opera had ended not with a tragedy, but with a dark, triumphant union. Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling, two souls fused in the heat of violence and the elegance of art, were finally free to explore the sensory delights of a world that was now their playground. The listener is left with a sense of chilling satisfaction, a realization that the most terrifying monsters are the ones who are perfectly composed, and that the greatest love stories are the ones written in the margins of the dark. The lambs were silent, the table was set, and the doctor was no longer alone.